All right. Well, thank you everyone for sticking around. And let's go ahead and have a look at the poll results here. So the interesting results here, so we say 33%, so a full third of the respondents have fully migrated to the web UI. So that's awesome. Good 47% are right now split between the web UI and the desktop application. So that would be the 2021.1 situation that we're going to talk about today. We have a full 13 who are still exclusively on the desktop, but testing out the web UI, and 7% haven't tried the UI yet. So a good distribution there of different circumstances here. So today, let me first introduce myself here. So I've been talking this whole time, but now I actually get to introduce myself. Brad Feakes. I've been with the Estes Group here now going on 10 years. I came to Estes from the Epicor kinetic world. So I was a kinetic consultant initially, and as I've been working with the Estes for several years now, I've been lucky enough to work with some really smart people on our team like Brent and Brad, among others, to learn more and more about the P21 application and some of its challenges, and have had some opportunities to be at the user community group meetings and such, and learn more about the challenges that users are facing. And one such challenge seemed to be related to the web UI migration. So today we're going to do a little bit of a hybrid session. I'm going to run you through some slides talking about what we've seen our customers do. So our good fortune is we host a lot of P21 customers, and they run the gamut from customers who are on very old versions to customers who are on the latest, to customers that are working through those kinks right now. And they're coming to us at times to help them through some of those kinks. What that allows us to do is to try and collect some of the successes, some of the failures, take those battle scars and turn those into knowledge that we can give to other people to try and help folks out, get them further along the way. Because when we were at the WUG, we really realized for the first time that that distribution was very similar. A lot of folks have not gotten fully onto the web UI and are struggling with concerns about their current status. So we pulled our heads together and try to come up with an idea of doing that. And we're gonna finish this. We're gonna start talking through some of the functional items about web UI, project management, planning, change management. And then we're going to shift to some of the technical matters and talk through some of those, and have Brent and Brad here who can jump in about a half hour, 25 minutes, and we can start talking through some of the technical solutions and the technical resolutions to common problems when you are in a migration situation. So let's jump right on in here and talk through that. So speaking to our agenda, functionally and technical. So we're going to start off reviewing the technical architecture of ERP systems here briefly, because that really the language we're going to be using is all based on that. We're going to talk about some planning considerations, how to plan for success. I'd say when we see a company struggling with the UI migration, sometimes the cause is they're doing it very haphazardly without a firm plan. We're going to talk about change management, some of the factors you want to take there to try to make that transition a little easier. Again, another reason that these projects sometimes stymie is that change management issues aren't given their due. We're going to cover, of course, the technical considerations. And really, we're going to wrap this up with a P21 roundtable. So if you have P21 friends who need answers right now, bring them into the room, get them, sit them down on a Chesterfield, and we'll have a wrap session. There isn't a question we won't do our best to try and answer. So let's talk real briefly, give a little introduction to client-server architecture. And when we talk about client-server, I always go back to the idea of different devices working with different roles that are communicating to one another over a network. All right, and that architecture layer, you talk about your classic elements of a client-server architecture. You start at your bottom level, your database, right? All your applications data ultimately resides there. It could be fed through an application server layer. These we talk about these as special use computers. We were even talking a little bit about that middleware server with Jordan about how special these special use computers might be in order to optimize some things. And they're normally hosting applications. And the client That's the actual end user facing portion of the application. And you hear two terms that are frequently thrown out there: fat client and thin client. So in a fat client situation, we're talking about where does the program logic reside. And with a fat client, the bulk of the program logic is residing on the client computer. Now, it could also be in a terminal server farm, which is kind of a stand-in for the client's computer, but really it's where are all those files, those compiled DLLs and accompanying files, where are they located? Now, with a thin client, it's really the opposite. It's that bulk of the programming logic is living at the application server layer. The client itself is thin. It has relatively little programming logic. So let's talk then about a two-tier architecture. That's kind of an important starting point, especially in P21. Now, like I mentioned, I came from the Epicor Kinetic environment. Epicor Kinetic has been a three-tier / n-tier architecture ever since I joined. This would have been 2008, if not sooner, where you had a distinct application server layer that talked to the database and all the clients. Normally, a version of a fat client, but not as fat, let's say, as the P21 desktop client. We're speaking through the application server layer. So learning that P21 has a different application history was really intriguing. So when we talk about the architecture layers of a two-tier architecture, you're dealing with a fat client on one side. All right, so it has a big, large footprint. It tends to be a hog of resources, which is why you end up putting them on terminal server farms, because quite often a real true desktop fat client can absorb so much resource on an individual PC that it makes it hard for the user to use Outlook, to use Excel, to use other competing apps. And that desktop application, that fat client, is speaking directly to the database. You can see here in this little pictogram, you have these desktop clients that are through the network speaking straight to the database. So the P21 legacy architecture was that fat client version with the desktop application, had an extensive business logic footprint that consumed a lot of resources, disk and IO and memory. And it was speaking to that P21 database and essentially, telling it what to do: read, write, delete. All of that was encased in that very simple two-tiered architecture. Now we get to a three-tiered architecture. Now you have something working a little different. You have that client, which is working through, quite often it's a thin client, or a web UI is a version of a thin client. It's talking to an application server, maybe through like a web server interface, another tiny layer in there. But essentially, the bulk of the work here is happening through the application server. That app server is then taking those inputs, translating them into things to do, and it's feeding the database server. It's telling the database what to do. And now, so the database itself it's receiving instructions from the app server instead of the desktop client. So P21's current version, where we're going right now with the middleware server, right? The user is now interacting with the application through the web user interface. That web UI now is speaking to the middleware server. And now the middleware layer, say that 20 times real fast without spitting all over yourself, it's interacting with the database. So that's that kind of transition we're all finding ourselves working through here. And we should probably talk about a web client architecture, because the biggest difference between a web client architecture and some of the models that preceded them was even with thin clients, you had some kind of installation footprint on the client computer. Web clients are nice in their purest form. Now, there are a lot of little hybrids too that come along, but a web client is part of a three-tier architecture. The client does not live on the end user's computer. There's no large collection of files that you need to install and keep updated. I came from the Kinetic world, where we had a fat client that was thinner than a desktop because it was speaking through the application server. And still, a lot of application server logic was living on the app server, not in the client. The client footprint ended up being pretty large. But in a pure web situation, the client is instantiated in a browser. It only lives in that browser while that browser is running, and business logic still lives at the application server layer. And if it needs to be sent to the user to validate data or assist with entry, it's coming from the application server layer. It doesn't live on that client computer. And so the biggest reason that kind of brought us to this conversation point is that for the past several years, as you all know, P21 has been moving from this two-tier architecture towards a three-tier architecture. That means on the server side, we're talking about middleware servers being spun up as a key element to speak to the database. And on the client side, it has to do with adoption of the web UI as opposed to the traditional desktop application. And there's kind of the problem that's inherent in all this. Now, this reminds me of my BMX days back in the late 80s. I can feel for that guy right there. The square tire too, for some reason, feels like something I would have done when I was prepubescent. But what is the problem statement here that we're trying to resolve? And this was something that really became clear to us at the WUG this year. So we're sitting in our booth talking to anybody who will talk to us, sneaking off to eat the free food whenever possible. And what we found in terms of sampling information from people was this idea of an inordinate number of companies still on the legacy desktop client. So in our survey today, this would have been 2/3 of people, and I think that's probably representative. That 2/3 of the people we were talking to were still in some version of the desktop. And I think no one was, people don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to stay on my old software. There are a lot of challenges, legitimate challenges that make moving off of the desktop hard. So they were expressing various challenges to trying to get themselves off of this existing infrastructure and into a more current architecture because of the trepidation due to the fact that the vendor is slowly cutting off support, and support of this last version that supports both the desktop and the web UI is atrophying rather quickly. And so you see customers languishing. Boy, I used a lot of thesaurus words on this slide. I apologize for that ahead of time. So a lot of customers are languishing in this, what I call the last branched version. Is it 2021.1? I think there's another dot after that, .4 perhaps. I get my dots mixed up. But needless to say, it's the last branched version that supports both the desktop client and the web UI. And the number of customers that were on this version was probably greater than last year. So last year, that was the conversation was this was the proper migration path. Get yourself to 2021.1 and work your users off the desktop and into the web UI. And that sounds like a great idea. And that was the religion that everybody had found last year. Now this year, they'd all found it and they had gotten to this spot, but they're not getting forward. They're not moving forward beyond it. So that was kind of the key challenge that we noticed coming out of the event. And we call this the 2021.1 conundrum. And the problem statement, part deux. Anybody see Hot Shots Part 2? I thought Part 2 was better than the first, but I'm a Charlie Sheen guy, so forgive me ahead of time. 2021 is, as we said, that last major release that supports the desktop and the web UI. So you can see in our version here, you have at the top, the desktop version is speaking over the network directly to the database, while the web version down below is speaking over the network to the middleware server layer. All right, so you have this kind of parallel architecture. Now, the good thing about this situation, and this has kind of been the message for the past year or more, is that it allows companies to slowly migrate the web UI to the web UI. Now, you have, say, the most difficult users who have the most complex situations. They might still be on the desktop. They might be due to customization. It might be adoption issues. It could be one of many issues, but they're on the desktop, and new employees come in, you get them on the web. Employees with simple business processes, get them on the web. The problem is, one, it's a cost issue. This is the most expensive option because what you end up with, one of the big expenses in a P21 desktop, two-tiered design is the terminal serve farm, because terminal servers can only take so many users before they're pegged out for resources. You can only build those things using Brent's early. You can only scale them up so much before you've capped off on users. So you end up scaling out and putting a whole lot of server footprint to support your users. Now, if you're doing that, and at the same time, now you're spinning up and you're dedicating hardware to have middleware server, and most often you're not stealing from Peter to pay Paul. You're just bringing in Mary Magdalene, and you're deploying the middleware server there. So you end up with a bigger overall footprint to support both the web UI and the desktop. So that ends up, between licensing and VMs and extra hardware you may have to be purchasing to support that, or hardware that you could be using otherwise it gets allocated. It's a big footprint. And one thing that we're learning is that as the newer versions of P21 come out, 2021 is not making web UI migration easy, because at this point, it's a suboptimal version of the web UI. The newer versions of P21's web UI are faster, cleaner. A lot of the bugs and little bothers that were present in 2021 aren't there anymore. The problem is, this is the last branched version, so companies are hesitant to get off of it, even though it's not a great version to actually support that web UI migration. So as you can see, it's not leading to a rapid web UI adoption as it was hoped. So that said, we kind of put together some thoughts as, what have we seen work well with customers, and what has been successful in getting folks over this finish line? Because we have that 33% who've pulled it off. So the question is, well, what did they do right to make that happen? And given where we're at right now, with 2021.1 slowly running out of support, 2023, those versions of the web UI are considerably faster. And Brent and Brad, I'll have them talk to that here shortly, because they'll be able to speak to it much more better than I can, frankly. But let's talk about some of the planning considerations, because as we mentioned, unsuccessful migrations quite often are unplanned migrations, right? A migration doesn't happen on its own. You need to lay out a path to get somewhere. And one is really assessing the impact and the value, right? There's a risk that is associated with moving to a new version. There's also value that is gained by it. And as the system gets older and older, that curve starts to invert itself. So understanding that for each organization, the risks and the values for every organization, we find quite different. Organizations, I also find, have different comfort levels in terms of their tolerance for disruption. I had one customer, we were talking about whether we were going to do a CRP event for their upgrade. And they were like, nah, I don't think we need to spend that time. The users barely gave us enough time to test it the first time. They don't want to test it again. And say, well, this means we'll go live, and we may have the possibility of having to vet issues in a live environment that we would have had to vet in a CRP. And they're like, yeah, we'll make that work. We'd rather do that. We'd rather fix it in live. Remember I don't normally test my code, but when I do, it's in production. You ever seen that meme? It's kind of like that. Other companies have absolutely zero tolerance for stoppage. They say, if I can't get orders in, I'm losing that business because the customer is going somewhere else. So we need everything absolutely locked down. So they'll be much more fastidious in the testing process, but also, not surprisingly, the migration process may not go as rapidly. And another key piece here has to do with integrations. And this is, I had given us a presentation once on hybrid cloud ecosystems, and I had this metaphor of a confused octopus, right? Each tentacle, let's assume that an octopus is your ERP ecosystem. Each tentacle is a third-party integration. Good time for it, since we had DCCAP and Web Connect, and they're dealing with third-party integrations. Now, sometimes you have this situation where the tentacles and the head of the octopus aren't moving in sync, right? Sometimes a tentacle lags because the technology gets old, the company gets bought out, and they don't do updates anymore, and a tentacle gets lopped off. In another case, a tentacle might move faster than the core system, than the head of the octopus, and it may get lopped off for that. What we see happening is, I had this with one customer where they were getting close to losing Rubbertree as their sales automation solution, because Rubbertree was advancing to kind of post on-prem installation models, and the version that the customer was on, its APIs no longer supported the connections that needed to be made. So Rubbertree essentially was aging out. So the value and the risk avoidance here had to do with, we need to get our core ERP system up to a current version just so we can keep using this mission critical functionality. So this is that idea of interoperability. There's another $5 word for you. The basic idea here is, when everything can work together without disruption, it's highly interoperable. And the older your system gets, your base P21 system, you start to have interoperability issues. So that's a problem. You need to be assessing for that as part of the planning process to make sure that, one, you're not leaving anything behind, and two, that you're doing it fast enough to stay ahead of the tentacles that are getting out in front of you. Now, I think what we've come to understand is that you really need to pick a migration strategy at this point in time based on what we have in front of us, right? We've talked about the 21.1, we've talked about things like 23. You need to have a migration strategy in terms of how you're going to get there. Are you going to do an incremental strategy where you implement on 2021, you get everybody off to that kind of crummy version of the web UI? Or are you going to do more of a big bang where you implement a newer version, 2023, in a test environment, and you work through all of that, and then you upgrade into that new version rather than trying to figure it out in the version you're at? Those are kind of the two options you have in terms of moving to the web UI. Another key consideration I want to talk about is customizations. Now, one of my techs, when we were talking about web UI conundrums, he noted, well, some of the folks who've been working through this, they actually found that there are customizations that they're no longer using. So they scratch those off the list. Why try to fight to upgrade this customization that's no longer relevant? Let's go through everything we've done and see what we can peel away and throw away and say, okay, we don't need to worry about that, okay? So the more you reduce the scope, the more you reduce the risk that this is going to hang you up and take longer than it needs. And another bullet then, when you consider with customizations, have to do with figuring out what will upgrade automatically as a function of the upgrade and what will need to be rebuilt. Now, we've seen a fair bit of those scenarios, and there are some specific steps you need to go through when you push the magic button. Brent spent some time educating me the other day on that magic button in this one version that you need to push before you go forward. And if you go too far, there's a point of no return. It gets fun. He'll tell you all about it. I'll ask the question, though. Key there is understanding what needs to be rebuilt, because quite often the critical path items, the big bottlenecks in an upgrade, will be those items. Are they like a type of portal that needs to be rewritten in SSRS for the latest version? I've seen that happen. We've had to do that for people, rewrite their portals because they no longer function appropriately in the new architecture. And we'll get to that, sorting out those things that need to be rebuilt as part of an upgrade and figuring out how you get that done. One key piece is the most key users who are affected by this, right? Some groups, I would see changes happen. Something happens, let's say in the finance area. Accounting is, okay, this is pretty much apples to apples. I'm good. Our system's pretty out of the box, not a lot of challenges. Sales perhaps might have a much more custom situation where there's a lot of special functionality and such, and the migration, the apples to apples, now you're more like an apple to a pomegranate, okay? And oh boy, we got to get this pomegranate back into an apple. And as I had said here kind of earlier in the context of customizations, bottlenecks, updating or identifying your bottlenecks early so that you can jump on them and start attacking them quickly, provided that you want to keep those things, right, is a key to keeping traction with your upgrades. So you always want to be on the lookout for bottlenecks as they surface. Another piece here, it was an interesting fact, is the concept of roles in your P21 system config. And I had Brad and team tell me a little bit about this, when roles and customizations kind of exponentially increase complexity. So you want to figure out, do I have a lot of roles and a lot of customizations? If I have a lot of both, those things multiply into a lot of permutations and combinations that could make for a bit of a testing nightmare. Be that as it may, you want to make sure you go into that open-eyed so that your test scenarios, your test cases may need to be a little more robust to handle all those variables, because what works for Mary and what works for Mark, if you have a radical number of different roles and customizations, may be very different, even if they're in the same department. And here the key, it really is no more simple than constructing a plan. If you don't plan to fail, you fail to plan. I think that my dad told me that once. I think it still applies. I think really putting together an idea of, this is how we're going to go through this. We're going to do an incremental, we're going to do this many testing cycles, we're going to have these people involved, really critical there, and keeping both change management and communication as part of that plan similarly important. So let's go through just a very high level. What does a plan look like for an incremental upgrade? So big thing with incremental upgrades is that you're in a live testing model quite often for customers that want to go through the branched version. And that's, we saw there's a fair number of folks who are in that version where I'm on 2021. We started off, everybody was on desktop. Now we're trying to pull people in to test the web UI version as much as possible. I have found what works well is if you create an adoption plan, and that's where you say, well, okay, so every Tuesday and Thursday, we're going to have people working in the web UI instead of the desktop version. If they run into bumps and issues, then we'll have them scoot back into the desktop version to sort those out and then, of course, raise those issues. But we're going to dedicate some days where people are just going to figure out the web UI, because there's, of course, some of it is functionality and some of it's just familiarity. So getting over that familiarity hump, sometimes you need to dedicate and draw some lines in the sand and say, okay, Tuesday afternoons, you're a web UI entry person. We'll get in there and figure that out. Once you've kind of figured out that adoption plan, we go through that process of doing the deployment, getting the web UI into the live environment, so those can be used in parallel, spinning up your middleware server. So going through that deployment model here, and then incrementally operating in that. So now executing on that adoption plan and flushing out the issues, right? What are the issues that you're coming out of? This is kind of an incremental process here, right? So every Tuesday and Thursday, we have a checklist of issues that we found that gets sent to your IT director or your ERP admin. And the ERP admin and the IT director, they're creating now remediation plans for all those issues. Okay, how are we going to fix these things? Is this something we can throw out because we don't need it? Is it something that should have upgraded properly? Did we miss a step in our upgrade and need to retry that step? Or is it something that we need to actually rebuild? And then you get a task list for your people of what they need to do to get through that. And you keep cycling through that until all of your testing issues have been resolved. And as you start resolving more issues, you start working to increase your users' days on the web. That adoption plan, okay, it was Tuesday and Thursday. Now it's Monday, Tuesday, Thursday. Now it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Okay, now we're through Friday until they have X amount, 90X% of their time on the web. As you get closer and closer to 90 something, whatever that magic number, you say, okay, by the time we're at 95, then we're going to cut it loose, and we're going to go 100%, and we're going to work through, we're going to figure out some workarounds for what's left. All right, you attain some form of user sign off to say, okay, everybody knows this is what we're going to start doing. So now you start drying up your remaining middleware servers. This is, of course, in a case if you have a big enough company that you need multiple middleware servers, right? And I assume most companies start off with a single middleware server for a small group to work. And as you get a larger group, you maybe have to starting to build up those middleware servers, depending on how many users, drawing down those terminal server farms and getting those off of the footprint. Because I think from what I've understood with my tech team, your middleware server footprint is going to be smaller than your terminal server farm was. So it's a net gain in the end. But a key, once complete, you want to plan that next migration, because you're really missing out on the benefits of the latest versions. And these, of course, I sound like a software salesman there. I think in this case, there really are some legitimate benefits between 2023 and 2021 in terms of performance, capability, and how robust and buttoned down these things are. So I think once you get through this, you should hope that the next migration is going to be that much easier, because the migration distance is so much shorter. All right, so that was incremental. Now let's talk about a big bang. Big bang is closer in kind of principle to an original implementation. So some of the same principles apply, right? So if you're going to move to a web-only version from a version that had desktop, all right, in order to take advantage of that functionality and the performance that you're having, you do more of a classic test model. So you would deploy the web UI to a test environment, and in that test environment, now you'd have to process all your business scenarios. You'd have all these business scenarios defined for what you do day to day. And of course, the challenge is, of course, with the end users is this isn't value added work. You're not entering orders in live, right? You're not getting live work done. You're getting essentially throwaway testing work done. some people, there's a big rub to that. It's one of those challenges you got to work through to try to keep your software current. Beyond working through your business scenarios, your unit testing, your customizations, right? Which customizations upgraded and fell into the right place. You're doing similar with your integrations. How are we hooking into this utility properly and making sure that your integration isn't reacting to the process differently? We find with new versions, sometimes things simple as like a method signature changes number of parameters, right? You go from 7 parameters to 8 parameters, and now the integration that was automating that specific business object blows up. Okay, we got to figure out what's wrong there. Is that a problem with the integration? Was it a custom integration? So you need to open up the project now, add that new parameter, even if it's just like a blank value or what have you. Sometimes it's that simple, adding that string parameter and assigning it a blank value is enough to make that integration work now, especially if it's something custom. You work through all of those integrations. You do a similar kind of remediation work plan, except it's not as cyclical. It's more, you do a testing cycle, you have a big batch, and then of all those things that you have to fix, you cycle through those now. And you similarly, really important in this stage that you're documenting those remediation steps so that all of those fixes can be applied when you upgrade for real in a production environment. I had that same situation with the customer I previously mentioned, the ones who don't want to go through a CRP event. That puts the onus on the mitigators, the remediators, to document those remediations each time when you migrate for good. Okay, I need to stick these report files in this location to make sure that these custom reports process properly, because they don't get there by default. You have to have that built into your cutover plan. And again, I'm a big believer in performing a mock cutover. Get a mock cutover and regression test your business to make sure everything is there. I tend to find 5 minutes, or 1 minute spent in testing during a CRP saves 5 minutes after you're live. All right, and if that testing has any little issues, you clean those issues up, and then you rinse and repeat, and you go live with that new system. So those are kind of your two options there for how to get yourself there. Now, regardless of the plans, whether you're big banging or whether you're incrementing, there are a lot of little change management considerations that I think are worth talking about. And kind of doing an honest assessment. Now, a lot of the P21 users have a real tight community, so you can kind of compare where you stand to where other users stand with their organizations. And the thing is, what's that organization's tolerance of change, right? This can drive how fast and how far you can go with this upgrade. Something that's a little different but related is what I would call the hammer factor of management. Now, when I've talked to companies that successfully migrated to the Web UI, quite often there was some sort of managerial hammer in place saying, we are going here by then, this is happening. We have to figure this out and make it work. All right. There's a sense of finality and definite management support. In the absence of management support, it's really hard to get these projects done. I'm telling this, I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure, but really this is one of those things you need to have management involved to the degree that they're going to support this process to mitigate the risks and the issues, right? Another thing I like to think about is super users. The most successful ERP implementations, whether it's P21, Kinetic, SAP, whatever, if you have a large community of power users, super users, folks who really want to get into the system, use it well and understand it, the more of those type of people you have in the company, the better. That really helps with adoption, with building traction, critical mass. The more you can find of those, so be on the lookout. Sometimes you have super users in hiding, and you don't really realize that you have the right type of resource out there. You just need to corral them and give them a little bit of extra TLC to get them there. Quite often, if you have an internal champion, someone at the business level, not in IT, I'm talking about someone like, your sales guy. We have someone in sales who's kind of half techie, and he or she is really pushing this as an internal cheerleader to help. Hey, we need to get here. Having someone like that, and so finding if those people are out there and then corralling them, kind of getting them on your side can be huge. You also want to assess kind of the opposite of that. This is kind of the size and impact of what we call the cave dwellers, the cave people. Now, cave, it's an acronym. I learned this when I was in Six Sigma back in the early aughts. Citizens against virtually everything. All right. Sometimes those are the folks who are driving an organization. And knowing that they're out there and trying to have mitigation plans for the tendencies to slow walk things, you need to be assessing that realistically, because I've seen unsuccessful implementations, hinge on a couple of well-placed cave people. Another piece that I found has worked really well is this idea of gauging user comfort levels over the course of the project. So this is the idea of, if you were going to give me a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being I'm absolutely don't understand this new web user interface, to 5 being I am an absolute expert and I could go live tomorrow. Asking people where they are on a 1 to 5 scale has a surprising effect, because it puts a lot of the onus on them, to own up to, what do you think? Where are you at? What do we need to do to get you there? Because if you're saying, well, I'm a 2 right now, okay, well, that's a number we can work with. Now, what do we need to do to get you to a 4? Because you can't, once you've said you're a 2, you can't go back to being a 1, not if we're doing our part. So, and I think that's very helpful. I've seen successful implementations focus a lot on that gauging of user confidence levels. And one half of change management, and this is where kind of change management and project management overlap, is the topic of communication. All right. One is communicating expectations. And I think it's an unfair expectation to say the new system will work exactly like the old. Now, the architectures are different. The look and feels different. Things will be different in the new system. And you may not always have a case where it's going to be an improvement. You may have dialed in the old system with some Dynachains rules and some form mods, and those things may not have transferred over to the new web UI, and it's just not going to function the same. Sometimes you just have to look that in the eye and say, this is how it's going to be. I understand this is a step back, but overall, this is a step forward. But I'd say don't hide those things, because those festering things like that never help a project move forward. Communicate the reasons. What's the justification for doing this? I think we've talked about these already. Lack of support is one big issue. The fact that now this whole structure you have is costly, it's antiquated, and it can't go on forever, especially if something goes wrong, right? With the application, you become more and more out on an island. So there's some justification to this whole process to get your entire organization forward. We talk about the plan. Communicate the plan. There's no need for this to be in a bubble to say, hey, we want to start here and we want to end here, and these are the steps to get there. And as you work through that, provide updates. You want to keep yourself accountable, but giving updates kind of shares that accountability to all the people who need to help get you there. And communicate the expectations in terms of, I need you to spend time helping me. If you're doing it on a could you, should you, please, versus and this goes back to the managerial hammer. If you have management helping you hammer out expectations, you can set those much more easily. And I think training and support's a big deal. When I hear a lot of, I step into a lot of old failed ERP system implementation attempts, and they come to us and they say, well, no one trained us. They just threw us to the wolves and said, figure it out. Okay. Use this as an opportunity to retrain your people on the new architecture, so there's no excuse. All right. And then we talked earlier about super users. One additional piece of super users, they're a great conduit for communication. All right, for disseminating information, hopefully positive information about the status of the project and where it's going. And this idea of soliciting feedback is a form of communication, right? Communication doesn't just always have to be me giving you information. It can be me asking for information from you. So it becomes more of a feedback loop versus just a feedback dump. And soliciting that feedback helps with that whole accountability question that you're always trying to figure out. All right. So that was the functional side of an upgrade in terms of the planning, the communication, the change management. I want to now step into some more technical considerations here. And I have my team here, Brad and Brent. So Brad and Brent, why don't you jump in here now, unmute yourself, and we're going to have a pretty free-form conversation here. I would ask the team, or our attendee team, to please submit questions here as you come along, and we'll just start talking through some of these. What we put together here with a bit of a technical consideration for the upgrade path, starting with, say, version 12 and working through some of the subsequent versions to understand, okay, if you need to update a specific solution set, when does it need to happen? When does something need to start? And we're going to have a pretty open-ended conversation because Brad and Brent know a heck of a lot about this application. So I'm going to ask some questions to these guys and get out of the way and let them talk. And please, as things come up, launch those. So Brad and Brent, let's kind of start from the left to right here, and let's just talk about the jet forms, and let's talk a little bit about the history of those and what you need to do if you find yourself on a version where you still have jet forms and you're trying to get forward.
Info maker and compilation. Wow, that goes back a long time. Jet forms goes back to the Acclaim days. Really, the migration for jet forms to Crystal, for the most part, they've been pre-written by Epicor, except for your custom jet forms. So they do have a Crystal package that does require, you can download it from Epic Web. It does require a password. And then there's a script that has to be run across your SQL that takes 2 seconds. Really, I mean, literally, it's a open it and go. And that converts you basically to utilize Crystal reports. However, if you do have custom jet forms, then they will have to be remodified with Crystal reports. They'll have to be completely rewritten. Epicor does not even support jet forms anymore, hasn't in multiple years. Francis, I think Francis has retired twice since then. He is like your jet forms guy. And if anybody's been with P21, I'd say Prophet 21, Activent, and I think he retired during Activent days. But it does not in any way, shape, or form work with the Web UI. So I mean, it gives a better, with the Crystal, it allows for modification by the end user, just by simple making the change and saving as an underscore user. So you can change things as you want and need, and don't have to go to Epicor to have that change, and it costs you an arm and a leg, just to have one minor change. On the rules, Brad, Dan?
Well, the rules actually came out. I mean, anyone that's had P21 that and has been going to insights and all of that in the past, and business rules came out, was kind of launched, I believe, in like 12, 15, 14, around there, right around the time when Activent was bought by Epicor, because the business rules thing that kind of came over from the E10 side of the world. And back then it was, you wrote it in .NET 3.5 was like kind of the starting point. And as the Web UI started morphing or coming available, you kind of had to upgrade your business rules. At this point, you'd want to make sure if you have any old business rules that were written in .NET 3.5, that either you have availability to the source code, a full functional spec, because I've seen it where clients are stuck with a DLL. It was a .NET 3.5 version and needs to be upgraded to a newer .NET version for the new Web UI. I would suggest that they should be upgraded to 4.8 or at minimum 4.7.2.
Yeah.
I don't write them in anything less than 4.7.2 now when I'm constructing business rules. If you don't have access, if you don't have access to that, there are tools out there that can decompile them with a fair amount of accuracy, not 100% accuracy. You're still going to want a developer to look at it, because when the code is decompiled, it's decompiled based on that decompiler's um, environment, as far as it knowing what .NET binaries were used or the library files that were used in the rule itself. When it decompiles, it doesn't decompile it with 100% precision. And you're left with still kind of redeveloping the rule. If you had rules that were forms based on the desktop, forget it. They're not going to work in the web UI. They're scrap. They need to be retooled. If you still need the visual aspect of it, you need to write it in as a web visual rule. However, there is a new functionality out that are visual attributes, which I haven't really. I've sort of started the beginnings of playing around with it. I haven't had a use case for it, so just building a rule to just build a rule is kind of, I don't know. You need a use case to really dive into what you can do with it. But the attributes rule basically allows you to pass visual type attributes that might be like a combo box or a drop down list or something. Because one of the drawbacks of the visual rules is it's MVC. It is a web URL. It is a fully functioning MVC kind of WPF web application. It's a mini web application that's using P21 stack, if you will. You can use their template, their hooks, their test harness and stuff for them. The challenges with the web visual rules is if you're in a load balanced environment, it can be problematic. We've run into clients that have had web visual rules where the load balancing aspect of it doesn't do it because the URL is actually hard coded into the database. It's not dynamic. That's point number one. Number two, if the visual rule doesn't return anything, it still flashes a tab in P21 and then closes it. So as a user experience, it's like, whoa, what was that? Or what does that just do? Or is that working right? It just kind of flashes the screen and kind of goes back to it. So there's some weird behavioral issues with the visual rules that can be problematic, and they're complicated to write.
I have a quick
They're
question.
very time consuming to write.
Awesome. We have a question come in here. It says the rewrite of the rules would need to be done prior to moving, for instance, to 22 if using the web UI in version 21, correct? Is that correct? Or are you referring to something else?
Right. So so if you have a form that was a pop-up form on the desktop client, like I don't know, you had example, a user clicked a button or something and a form popped up for them to select a value inside of a data grid on a Windows form or a bunch of fields they could fill out, hit save, and it would close that window and return values back into the desktop client. That same type of a rule has to be converted to a visual rule before you migrate to the web UI, in which case then you will have two versions of the rule doing the same functionality, one for desktop, one for the web, which presents a lot of challenges in itself. Now you're keeping two versions of a rule that's meant for two different platforms. It's tricky. I don't envy anyone that has a lot of forms-based rules in the desktop that got to migrate them to the web UI because it's a large undertaking.
But if you got it fixed in 21, will it migrate on its own now to 22, 23 onward?
Yes, it should. If you built the web visual rule in 21.1, it should migrate to all the newer versions without
as long as it functions within the web UI, it'll continue to function on up.
Now,
No,
I throw that out there with a caveat: test it before, just to make sure, because there are different bugs that have been along the way with visual rules not returning the fields properly. It passes to the wrong field. There just could be a numerous little quirks that happen. So test it first. And if not, then you would have to debug it or put in a support ticket with Epicor to say, hey, it was working in this version. Why is it not working there? And they
Sure.
may come back and say, here's the solution.
Now let's go back to load balancing for a second here. New question. You mentioned the error regarding the web visual rule while using a load balancer. Is that a specific version or all versions?
Yeah. So if you're familiar with the setting, hooking in a business rule, when you hook in a web visual rule, you have to put in the URL for it in P21 in order for that visual rule to work. And then you hook in all your fields and whatever it is you have to do to to instantiate the rule, pass the values back and forth from P21 to the rule and back again. All of those pieces are part of the MVC rule. That URL you paste in there is stored in a value in the P21 database as a hard-coded URL. The problem that's in the past is when you're load balancing, you're using either a proxy or a forwarder or cookies or something to do the load balancing. You can't use a URL in that visual rule path that is dynamic to the load balancer front end because it won't find the rule. I have not been able to successfully, if someone figured out the secret sauce on that, post it in the WUG or something, because I know multiple clients, and I even experienced it in the past at my previous organization where we had written some visual rules. We had a load balancer across 6 middleware servers, and oh boy, you had to pick one of the servers. Middleware servers had to be the web visual rule launching server because we couldn't get them to load balance.
All right, that makes sense. Now, Brent, at one point when I think we were having dinner with some folks and we were talking about P21 upgrades, and you described one specific upgrade step where you needed to go somewhere in the system config and push a button. All right, so this is my push a button question. Can you tell me about pushing a button?
The magic button that Epicor has so hidden far off that you won't find it unless you know where it is. It is in 21. It is not in 22. So if you do the upgrade prior to this button pushing, you will have to do it with a stored procedure or with a SQL script, which actually takes a little bit longer and has a little more into it. So within version 19, 20, and 21, if you go into system settings, and then go to system setup, and then go to interface, and when that comes up, you're going to go, there's no button. Look at the bottom, and there's a scroll bar that goes all the way to the right. When you go all the way to the right, you're going to see a button that says Migrate Dynachange. When you click that button, it will take literally 10 seconds, and all of your Dynachanges are migrated to the web UI. Now, as Van always puts it, the caveat to that is that if you make that change, if you do that migration of those Dynachanges to the web UI, everything will still function as normal. However, if you make a change in the desktop version of your Dynachange, it will not be available in the web UI, and you'll have to do it all over again. However, if you make a change in the web UI for that Dynachange, it will never work in the desktop version. So once you migrate, just consider yourself migrated. And if you're going to make any change to a Dynachange, make it in the web UI and, just be done with it. So the other part of that is it doesn't always 100% work. We do have a script that we do run whenever we run that. And what it does, it literally tells us if the Dyna changes have been migrated or not, with a yes or no. And if they're at a no, then we have to run it again until it does say yes. I have not had too many Dyna changes not eventually migrate or have to redo a Dyna change based on going from the desktop to the web. The biggest issue I've had is when folks have gone to 22 and then they want to try to do the migration of their Dyna change. It does have a little bit of a sticky point. So, and again, you know, there is a stored procedure. There's also a script to do the migration, but it's a little rough around the edges when you get past that 21 point.
Okay. And when you say Dyna change, is this the entire suite of Dyna changes or one specific subset are we talking about?
No, it's all Dyna changes. Whether it be this word's red and I want this, you know, we have changed the labels to all of our things and they're not default at all. Or there's a note box here, or there's a you know, customer field, you know, a customized field. There's a customized SQL table that's been put in and information goes to that. All of that stuff has to be migrated for it to function within the web UI. And we've had people go, well, I'm in the web UI and none of my Dyna changes are there. That's because they never migrated them. Once they migrate them, everything you had in the desktop is going to be there. And that's one of the biggest fears, as we found, is with folks going to the web UI, is they're afraid it's not going to be the same. And it is the same. Things are still in the same spot. You just have a whole lot more options to be able to utilize to actually make your job easier.
Okay, so when it comes to Dyna change migration that you've talked about, what is the success rate for the actual rules and changes migrating over without the need for fixes, tweaks, etc.?
Probably about 95, 96%. I'd say. I wouldn't, you know, I'm not going to give it 100% at all, but probably a good 95, somewhere in the middle, 95 to 100. You know, that 99. There's always that 0.1% that's not going to work.
Right.
But I would say a good 95% will work right off the bat.
If you have non-visual rules, yeah, between 95 and 99% confidence.
Yeah. Now, if they're visual rules, that button's not there for that.
Okay, so that isn't included in that upgrade.
No, not at all.
All right. Well, let's talk about portals. We've done a fair bit of portal work and we've upgraded portals and changed them over to SSRS for some customers and others. So what's the success rate on portal migration as part of an upgrade?
The biggest thing is converting them to an SRD, and then your basic portals will actually work. Where before they were in a library file, you know, an InfoMaker library file. But once those are saved as an SRD, they'll work in the web UI. Now, if they're an SSRS, that's a different, Dan, that's you, man.
Well, so there actually, I will speak to a couple of cool things when you have migrated your standard library files and pulled out all your portals and saved them off as SRD files. You'd have to open up the PBL file, open up a specific portal and go save as file SRD, and it will break out that portal as an SRD. The nice thing when you migrate it into the web UI that I've noticed in 23.1, I might have been in 22. I can't speak because I skipped, I think I pretty much passed over 22. I don't know. Anyway, in my sandbox is when you pull it in, it takes on some of the characteristics of all the other column tab window or column or data sets in transaction windows, in that you can filter on those columns. You can sort any of the columns in your portal. It automatically adds that functionality, which is actually a really cool tool. And another one is you can take that and go save as Excel.
Yeah, and you know, even with that, with the portals, Brad, just on top of that is that, you know, with the widgets on the front when you first log into P21, where most people would log into the desktop and then they have a portal, but then if they need another portal, they have to tell somebody. And then
Yeah.
basically with the new web UI interface, if you have access to that portal, you can add whatever portals you have access to and move them around and situate them the way you want them. You can sort them, and they will all stay the way you left. So there's a
Yep.
whole lot of customization within that.
Yeah. SSRS. If you've got SSRS already, one of the things that I've learned or noticed, and I've actually, it's several of the, like, well, the two Lake Erie users group sessions I've been to, the chatter is, how do I get SSRS? If you have drills or anything like that, like drill targets or drillable fields and stuff in SSRS, how do I get it to not open up multiple windows and stuff like that? So the challenge is people that are taking SSRS and embedding them as a web element inside of a portal in P21. I strongly recommend against that because P21 loads it as an iframe. And in the HTML world, that's like hated. You can't do anything with it. The formatting inside of it is limited. You're limited with what you can do and customize in the SSRS portal itself. I recommend if you've got an SSRS server, make the portals a menu item. Or if you're going to put them as widgets, make them as linked widgets, where you give SSRS has a little bit of freedom to do things, and it's not so much an iframe because the drill targets in that end up opening on themselves. It suppresses any little JavaScripting you might run in it, and that's not P21's fault. That's the browser fault. That's Chrome adding extra layers of security now, because a lot of hackers and threat actors and that do things with iframes and stuff. You get pop-up ads, you get all kinds of crap happens. So they just block it all together. So I found Chrome is very limiting on that. So if you're using SSRS, I recommend adding it as a menu item because it launches to the SSRS server as a web UI, and you can customize SSRS to suppress header values and different things, how you want to shape it, but you won't run into the limit of having issues of opening transaction windows in P21 so much. Because that was one of the biggest things is like, oh my God, I'm clicking on an order, it opens up another tab. I'm clicking on an order, it opens up another tab. And if you've got drill targets in the SSRS, it keeps just opening up tab after tab after tab. So it can be frustrating.
Sure. So now when I look over our upgrade path document, I see in version 22 we were discussing the rewriting of DynaChange elements. When would you find yourself having to rewrite DynaChange elements? Is this specifically with the visual form rules, or are there other instances beyond that?
I would say when it doesn't work.
Yeah. If the DynaChange migration didn't work, to Brent's point, you just have to recreate it. So take an inventory of what came over, what didn't, and fix the things that broke.
Gotcha.
And it could be the whole thing, and it could be just a piece of it. So
gotcha. Now, at the bottom of version 22, we talked about customizations. Now, is this, I'm of course not a P21 longtime user, so I've heard of the term custom. Is that what we're talking there when someone's created a custom and that now you have to figure out a way to get that logic to work?
They didn't create it. Epicor did.
Sure.
So it's almost a decision to, do you really need that functionality? Piece. Have they added a module that actually overtakes that? A prime example would be way back in the day with Parker, and people would have so many different customizations based on Parker's requirements that Epicor finally wrote an actual module that is nothing but Parker that coincides with their requirements. So, I mean, those customizations, a lot of those customizations, and I hate to say this for those out there, when you have Epicor write a customization and you pay for that customization, give it about 2 versions and everybody's going to have your customization. They do. They roll it into the next big push out. A prime example would be this report is more than 100 pages. Do you still want to run it? Well, the company I worked for 15 years ago, we had that customization made. And now it's in every version out there. And we spent the $1,500, $2,500 it was to have it put in there. And that was to stop users from running a report so big that was open-ended.
Right.
So, you know, with those customizations, you need to decide whether or not you really want to keep them. And if not, I mean, if you do, then yes, you'll have to go to Epicor and have a rewrite, have a custom rewrite.
Well, so to that point, an example too is the box content label, the content label functionality in WMS and P21. That was a custom that was built that I worked on the process design for back in 2010, 2011, because the owner of the company I worked at was floored that you couldn't take other packages and put them inside of a bigger package and put a contents label on that box and put the contents on a packing list so that your customer, when they got a skid of all those little boxes, knows what's in what, because it goes to different departments from a barcode. So we worked that in. Well, it actually didn't get rolled into baseline functional. It was a licensed feature that they activated. You had to get the scripts and you paid Epicor for it. It didn't become baseline until I think I want to say 12.15, 12.16. They ended up throwing it in as baseline. But if you're paying, if it becomes baseline, and you would probably stop paying support on it. But any customization Epicor writes, you pay a per annum. You pay a per annum customization support, which is usually like 20% of the original cost of the customization. You'll pay that 20% per year. So you want them to roll it in as quick as they can into the main baseline functionality, because then you stop paying support on it.
Sure.
Yeah, with the GSA, with the government contracts, in 2015, 2016, the government started requiring the barcode to be that way with a 128 QR code, or a 120. Well, with a QR code, it was a 128, where it was a box inside a box inside a box inside a box. And then when they received that one box, they would scan that one barcode, and then it would completely receive every single item in every single box, every single case, because it was just, you know, where you have one big box to 4 boxes to 6 boxes on down. So yeah, I mean, it became a government issue as to why they actually rolled it in there. They had too many people under ITAR that required that functionality.
Nice. I got a new question here that came in. Question asks, what has been the biggest single complaint from clients that have migrated to the Web UI? Is there a complaint that stands out above the others?
Yeah, I can't change my colors. And that is the truth. They're actually looking to do that in the next couple of versions or something like that. But yes, that's because I have folks saying the colors hurt my eyes. From a different perspective, really it depends on the infrastructure. Some will say it's faster, some will say it's slower. Most of it, to be honest with you, it's change. Mm-hmm. And you know, as being humans, most people do not like change. And once they get used to using it, it's no different than people started going from 1 monitor to 2 monitors to 3 monitors. And when they had 1 monitor and you tried to offer 2, they didn't want it. But once they used it, they went, "Oh, this is the greatest thing in the world." Right. So, you know, it's the training side of it. I would say would be the most complex as far as getting folks to say the biggest issue. But as far as in my experience, from going from the desktop to the Web UI, There are some things that are different, such as scheduled tasks. There are some things that are in a different place. They've been moved to a different spot, or they've been taken out, but you can add them back in. And it still always rolls back to, well, this is the way it was, or this is the way it's always been. You know, it's I don't want to use the terminology old dog new tricks, but I mean it's moving up in the world. I mean it's going to the next level, you know, to give your business more productivity.
Sure. Now we're at our extent here of our time, so I'm going to ask one last question here in terms of differences and performance. You brushed on quickly. Can you guys tell a little bit about the performance differences between 21 and 23 and what that means technically?
Brad, you know more about the searching bit than I do, so.
Yeah, one of the things I've worked quickly, I've worked with several customers that we just spent hours turning our wheel, squeezing every bit of performance out of SQL Server, and to no avail. You still run a bunch of metrics against SQL Server, and you discover that the longest, most expensive running queries were the search pop-ups, the search windows, item searches in order entry, item searches in item master inquiry, items anywhere where there's a search box was taking a long time because of the way they did the queries in the background and the number of records that it would return. They significantly, they did a major overhaul and rewrite on that for 23.1.
Yep.
Big time. Another one, if you're WMS is its own web app now for the web UI. And you don't even need to do port bindings anymore. Like, you don't have to install the web app piece of P21. You can just install the middleware server and all the web apps are in there. You're just going to do URL : port number / Profit21 or / P21 WMS. And it's a dynamic, sizable web app, and it works great on whatever your device is. And the best thing about the web UI with WMS is it's device agnostic. You're not bound to the old symbol Motorola's that are all dying. You had to USB port connect them to a Windows 7 PC to update them. I know a lot of people that are still hanging on to those devices with dear life, that are like scratching their heads, what do we move to? I've made recommendations to clients, like there's,
the Zebra handheld, the Honeywell CK65, because your old scanners, your original scanners, will not work with the web UI.
You need Android. It needs to be Android OS and
or Apple iOS, which I would not recommend.
Yeah, Keyence is another good device. I've used the Zebra, actually, TS21 or TS22 or whatever it's called. It looks like a phone.
Zebra took over the old rugged MC9000 series. Yeah. So, you know, from Symbol to Motorola to Zebra. As you said though, with the wireless warehouse, and you were talking about port binding, you really, there is a way to do this without using port binding and tying it to a single wildcard cert. And within that, because it passes 80 and 443 without having to have a port, you can set that in IIS, and then you just have p21.mydomain.com. You don't even have to put the Profit21 at the end. You can have p21play at mydomain.com or p21 WWMS at mydomain.com.
Sorry, I meant the port binding. If you install the web app piece on the same IIS server, you have to bind it to a different port than the middleware.
Yes,
but you're doubling up the applications you're installing on IIS. So there's no need to install the web app piece. I think that actually came out in 21.1. That was
21.1 or 21.2.
Yeah, it was one of the big changes.
Excellent. All right, fellas. Well, I appreciate all the insights here. We're 5 minutes over here, so I'm going to release our audience here for the day. Want to have a huge thank you to our attendees for being part of this event. Now, we will be presenting out this information to our YouTube site. We'll send some links as those things come. We'll also do some work to try and get the materials from some of these presentations put together, should you be needing any of those. If you have any need for something specific, don't hesitate to reach out to me specifically. I got my email address up there. Would love to hear from you if you have any questions. If you had a question that you wanted one of our team members to answer, but didn't have time to ask, by all means do that as well. And this concludes our Profit 21 Summit for 2023. Thank you again, everyone, and have yourself a wonderful day.